Not every day we have an opportunity to hear from someone that has such influence around the world. Please give a huge, warm welcome to Dr. Katharine Heyhoe.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I know that all of this snow and ice and cold temperatures are just to make me at home. I'm so grateful for it. Being Canadian, living in Texas, I actually miss the winter weather. But when I left Texas a few days ago, it was a whiteout blizzard. And it was colder in Texas than it was in Canada. It just goes to show you never know. So we've just left the Christmas season. And I know some of you are probably heaving a sigh of relief. And others of you are wishing that it would be longer so we wouldn't have to get back to work or school. As Christians, though, we know that the Advent season, the Christmas season, offers us a unique opportunity to remind ourselves and to think about the incredible gift that God gave us. Christmas is a time to reflect on the fact that Christianity is unlike every religion on the planet. Religions say, work for God, do your best for God. What can you give God? Christianity says, what did God give us? That the only thing he asks of us is to accept that incredible gift. Why was Christ's gift so amazing? It wasn't just the fact that God gave his son to be born as an actual human physical baby in this world. That's what we believe as Christians. But it was the fact that that baby grew to become a man who died on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins, and who rose again on the third day to give us a new life. Our problem is not just that we had a bunch of bad stuff we'd done. Because if Jesus had just died and that was the end of it, we'd be spiritually dead, forgiven people. We needed to become alive to God. And by his resurrection, he gave us that new life. And that's what it says in Ephesians. Is that because of his great love for us, God, being rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ. When before we were dead in sin. It's by grace that we're saved. That is the core of our faith, and that is the greatest gift that God has given us. The forgiveness of sins and the new life of his Son. Have you ever stopped to think, though, what God's second greatest gift might be? Now, you could be thinking it's a certain attribute of the Christian life. You could be thinking maybe it's the Holy Spirit. Maybe it's a real person in your life. There could be a lot of answers to that, but I'm going to tell you my answer. I would say that the second greatest gift that God gave us is the gift that gives us not our spiritual life, but our physical life. This amazing world that we live in. We humans are not designed to float around in the vast outer reaches of space. We're designed to live on an incredible planet that gives us the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink. And we know that somehow this physical world is important to God. There are verses all throughout the Bible talking about God's love and care for things as insignificant as birds and grass. But there are also plenty of verses talking about the importance of Christ becoming a real, living, flesh and blood human being. Of being a baby who, if you pinched him, would scream. Of being a man who, when you pounded nails into his wrists, would bleed. Of being a person who, when he was put on a cross, would die. There's something important about being physical, and the reason why we're here today, why we have bodies that we walk around in, is because we have a home in which to live. I'm very fortunate in that I get to study our planet almost every day. That's what I do. And I specifically study this part of our planet, our atmosphere. Our atmosphere is incredibly unique because it has just the right mix of gases for us to breathe. You don't often think about your breath, do you? But take a breath right now and think about it as you breathe. We're breathing this perfect blend of gases that God has put here to support life on Earth. What we don't think as much about, though, is the fact that besides the oxygen we breathe, and besides the nitrogen that makes up more of the atmosphere than oxygen, if you remember your high school science, besides that, there's other things in the atmosphere, and some of them, they're not in there in very big amounts, but they're very powerful and they're very important. And one of the most important things we have in our atmosphere are naturally occurring heat-trapping gases that act as a blanket around our planet. How does this work? What happens is the sun's energy shines down on the earth and goes right through this natural blanket, almost like a window. The earth heats up in response, but instead of all that heat escaping to space, our incredible atmosphere traps most of that heat, keeping our planet almost 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it would be otherwise. We would be a frozen ball of ice if it were not for these amazing, incredible little heat-trapping gases in our atmosphere that wrap a blanket around our Earth. And that's just one of the incredible ways that our planet is just perfect for us to live on. Now, when we think of our planet, we often think of it kind of like this, right? This is one of those NASA pictures from space. And we look at it and we think, well, it's this perfect, pristine, untouched globe. But we have to realize now there's a lot more people than there used to be. Today, we're pushing 7.5 billion people on this planet of ours, this home that God has given us. And so today, I think a more accurate way to look at our planet is not during the daytime, but rather at night. And so this is literally, I'm going to show you a picture of the planet at night. This is taken by NASA astronauts. Look at that. Isn't that crazy? You know what you're looking at? Lights. Those are lights. If we zoom in on the United States, you can see even more clearly, look, this is the corridor we're in right now. You can see cities, right? You can see highways. Isn't that crazy? So people say, well, how can someone as small as a person, how can somebody as small and insignificant as humans affect something as big as our planet? Well, the answer is if there's 7.5 billion of us, we definitely can. And you can just see us. You can see the impact of our lives spreading out across the planet from outer space. Now, for those of you good at geography, I want you to cast your eyes over, west of here, over up to North Dakota. Can you find North Dakota? I want you to particularly find the really big city in North Dakota. Do you see that big city? Now, if you're really good at geography, you're thinking, what big city? Anybody ever been to North Dakota? Sorry, if you're from North Dakota, I apologize. I'm talking about that. And that is actually not a city. That is the light from thousands of flaring wells that we use to get oil and gas out of the ground. And this points to a huge way that we as humans are putting our finger on the balance of our planet and tipping it away from that equilibrium that God designed for us. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been digging massive amounts of coal. This is a very old picture. And natural gas and oil out of the ground and burning it. We've been using it to power our society. Now, don't get me wrong, the Industrial Revolution was a great thing for us. I live in Texas, where the majority of the economy is still based on oil, and it brings enormous prosperity to the state. I know that without the health advances that we made during the Industrial Revolution, I probably wouldn't be alive today. And I certainly know that my life would not be nearly as comfortable if I lived 300 years ago. I don't know about you, but I never want to go back and live in those Jane Austen days. Although there are places I hear where you can go and do that for a week just to try it out. Everything comes with a cost, though, and we know that many of the ways in which we get our energy and we use our energy have a negative impact, not just on this world, this home that God gave us, but on people, too. Here's just two examples. If you've ever been to the Appalachian Mountains, you might have seen the beautiful, untouched, pristine national parks, but you might also have seen the cheapest and easiest way for companies to get coal out of the ground, which is literally cutting the top off mountains. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is that by cutting the top, literally, off a mountain, you create enormous pollution problems. And one of my friends, Marianne Hitt, who's also a fellow believer, for example, she wrote this about mountaintop removal in Appalachia. She said that mountaintop removal, coal mining, allows toxic heavy metals to leach into their local water supplies. People who live in mining areas, typically people who aren't that well off, people who live there have higher incidence of cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, birth defects, premature mortality, and other health issues. It's affecting people who can't afford to live elsewhere or get other jobs. What's another way that fossil fuel affects us. Fossil fuels affects us. This is a picture of air pollution. You will all probably know what air pollution looks like. It looks nasty. It looks worse, bad here, it looks worse in China. Did you know that it has a huge impact on our health? Every year, air pollution coming from tailpipes of our cars, smokestacks of factories and power plants, every year air pollution kills 5.5 million people around the world. In the United States, it kills 200,000 people every year. Now imagine if something else killed 200,000 people. Imagine if the bird flu killed 200,000 people every year. Imagine if domestic terrorism killed 200,000 people every year. Imagine the headlines, imagine the government initiatives, imagine the action to fix this problem. So why have we become so inured to this issue? It's because it's been around for so long, and it's because the people most affected are the people who live in poor neighborhoods, who can't afford to buy a house in a nice neighborhood, so they live next to a freeway or next to a factory or a power plant. And they're the people who often lack the voices to make change. People in poor neighborhoods are breathing worse air. So this often leads us to the idea of stewardship or creation care. In Genesis, it talks about how we're made in God's image, and that's often one of the first things we learn when we become a Christian or when we go to Sunday school. We learn we're made in God's image. But often what we learn stops there. It doesn't continue in the rest of the verse. Did you know that there's a reason why we were made in God's image? And that reason is so that we could be responsible. For what? For every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. So some people might say, how can humans affect something as big as the planet? Because God's in control anyway. So aren't you saying that if humans are affecting the planet, that God's not sovereign anymore? No, what I'm saying is God gave us responsibility over our planet. And it says so right in Genesis 1. We're the ones who are responsible for everything here. And it goes on in the New Testament to talk about how people who have been given a trust are required to be faithful to that trust. We've been given a responsibility. God expects us to live up to it, just like we expect our children to live up to the responsibilities we give them. Each of us should use whatever gift you've received. What greater gift, again, than this amazing planet that we've gotten? Each of you should use the gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards. So this is where the idea of stewardship or caring for creation comes from. And it comes from the visual or the visible impacts that we can see, air pollution, water pollution, and the impacts that has on our health. But today, that's not the only issue that we have to deal with. Because when we look at what's coming out of a smokestack of a power plant, for example, what you're looking at here is actually mostly steam. What you don't see coming out are all of the heat-trapping gases that are produced when we burn coal and gas and oil. You see, because coal, gas, and oil are carbon-based fuels, and when you burn them, they combine with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, and I promise that's all the chemistry you're going to get. And carbon dioxide is one of the most important heat-trapping gases in our atmosphere, in our natural blanket. So if our blanket is natural, then you might say, well, what's the problem? The problem is that the blanket is natural, but by burning coal and gas and oil, we are adding to that blanket. We're putting more of that stuff into the atmosphere than God ever designed. And by doing so, we're essentially wrapping an extra blanket around our planet, and our blanket is trapping more heat. It's like when I used to stay at my grandma's house when I was little. For some reason, she was always afraid we'd freeze to death at night. So she'd sneak in and she'd put an extra blanket on us, and we'd wake up in the middle of the night saying, "Grandma, I didn't need the blanket." That's what we're doing to our planet. We're wrapping an extra blanket around it that it did not need and it was never designed to have, and that blanket is trapping more heat. And that is why our planet is running a fever. Now, the most visible impact of that fever is the fact that our global temperature is going up. You might say, but hang on, I read in the news, or I heard somebody say that actually if you look at the world's temperature, this is temperature measured by thousands of thermometers all around the world, averaged up. If you look at it, that's not going up. Is it? No, it's not. Well, here's the thing. We have two things going on. We have weather, up and down, up and down. And then we have climate, the long-term average of weather over 20 to 30 years or more. So this is weather. This is climate. Our planet is warming. And thermometers all around the world tell us it is. Now, my husband's a pastor, and we go to a church very much like this one. In fact, we have the same chairs. So I feel very at home. I feel kind of like I'm at home here. As my husband says, a thermometer is not Democrat or Republican. A thermometer tells us the same number. It doesn't matter how we vote. But you might say, okay, but I could swear I've heard people saying it isn't warming. Or it's just a hoax, or those scientists are all making it up. The thermometers, the science, isn't political, but you know what is political? The solutions. Because for many of us, we've been told that if we're going to fix this issue, there's only one way to do it, and that's to let the government tell us everything to do. How to set our thermostat, what type of car to drive, how much water we're allowed to use. We've been told that's the only solution, and who wants that? The reality is, and we'll talk about this, there are many solutions that can come from our heart that are consistent with our faith and our values. But denying the evidence of God's creation, sticking our fingers in our ears, and shutting our eyes to what God's creation is telling us is not the way forward. Because we could throw out all the thermometers in the world. We could throw out all the scientific data in the world. We could just look at what I call natural thermometers or God's thermometers. We could look at when the tulips bloom, when the trees flower, what type of animals or insects or birds we see in our backyard. We could look at snow and glaciers and sea level. We could look around the whole world, and using God's thermometers, we have 26,500 independent records showing us that the planet is warming today. Now, you might say, though, hang on, I have another question. And I know there's a lot of but what about questions. I only get to a couple of them today. But what about the fact that climate has changed naturally in the past? Anybody who has ever watched the Ice Age movie, or if you have children, you've watched it 50 times, we know that the world didn't always look quite as nice and pleasant and warm as it was today. We know that climate has changed in the past, and it's changed for two reasons. It's changed because of natural cycles, and it's changed because sometimes we get more or less energy from the sun. So as a good scientist, it's kind of like if you went to the doctor with this kind of stubborn fever, and the doctor takes one look at you, doesn't even run any tests. The doctor takes one look at you and says, Ebola. And you're like, maybe it's just the flu or food poisoning. So in the same way, climate scientists, when we see the Earth running a fever, we don't immediately yell global warming. We say, okay, could it be a natural cycle, or could it be the sun, right? So here's the thing, though. If we were getting warmer because of the sun, we'd have to be getting more energy from the sun, right? So the sun's energy would have to be going up for our temperature to be going up. If we look at our Earth's temperature, here's our Earth's temperature over the last 100 years or so. Here's energy from the sun. It was going up a bit, it plateaued in the 70s, and since then it was going down. So if we were controlled by the sun right now, it would be cooling, not warming. What about natural cycles? Well, if you look at our last 6,000 years, if you look at humans' civilization on this planet, there weren't a lot of big natural cycles. And in fact, if anything, we were sort of gradually cooling, because if you look a bit farther back to the ice ages, we're way past the last ice age, and we should be eventually, not tomorrow, not next year, but we should be eventually heading into the next ice age. That's where we are in the natural cycles. But something happened. And something happened to heat-trapping carbon dioxide. I know I said no more chemistry. This is the same chemistry. It doesn't count as new chemistry. Something happened to carbon dioxide at the same time. Something weird is going on. This is not a natural cycle anymore. So if you have any more questions about the science, this is not supposed to be a science lecture. There's a great resource I can point you to called skepticalscience.com. They have an iPhone app, too. It's founded by John Cook, who's a fellow believer, and it's dedicated to looking at all the what about questions about climate change and answering them with real science where you can go and find the answers for yourself. So I would point you there. Because I want to move on now to what I think really, especially for us as Christians, is an even bigger question than is it real? The even bigger question, in my opinion, is, so what? Right? Because if you look at a movie or a book or a news article where it's talking about global temperatures are going up or sea level is rising or sea ice is melting, they have a picture on the cover of that book, or they have a picture in that news article. And that picture always has the same thing in it. It is a large animal. It is white. It is a polar bear standing on melting ice, right? In fact, this is a picture I just took from the most recent article I could find. Yes. So here's the thing. If this whole problem is only really a problem for the polar bears, I'm going to be totally honest, why not put a few of them in the zoo? Now, don't get me wrong, I love polar bears. I'm Canadian. You can't not. But if we're talking about figuring out different ways to get energy besides coal and oil and gas, and it's only about the polar bears, really? That seems a bit excessive. But last year, I was actually invited by Polar Bears International to go up to the Arctic with them to track the polar bears out on the ice. The polar bears are being affected by climate change because the Arctic sea ice is melting. And that's the only place the polar bears eat. During the summer, they go on land and they fast all summer. So I was invited to go up to the Arctic with Polar Bears International at the beginning of November when usually the ice forms and the polar bears go out on the ice to finally eat after months of starvation. But there was no ice in sight. The ice did not come in until the middle of December. But when Polar Bears International first invited me to go with them, I said to them, well, I gotta be honest with you, who wouldn't want to go, But I study how climate change affects people, because that's where my heart is how this affects people, especially poor people. And then they said something to me that I will never forget. They said, we study the polar bears and we care about the polar bears and we want to understand what's happening to the polar bears because they're telling us that if we don't heed their warning, we're next. Why are we humans, the most vulnerable species on the planet, the most vulnerable people, why are we so vulnerable to climate change after the polar bear? It's because there's 7.5 billion of us now. Imagine if you lived on Manhattan Island, where New York City is today. Imagine if you lived there 1,000 years ago. And imagine if sea level rose 3 or 5 or 8 feet, as it's projected to do this century. Imagine if it happened 1,000 years ago. What would you do? Pick up your tent and move, right? Imagine if you were a farmer or if you lived off animals or the land out in West Texas and it got too hot for you to grow your crops, or the animals that you fed off moved north because it was getting too warm. What would you do 1,000 years ago? Pick up your tent and move. Why can't we do that anymore? Because with 7.5 billion people on the planet, every acre of arable land is already accounted for. And 2/3 of the world's biggest cities are within a few feet of sea level, and we can't just pick them up and move them. We care about a changing climate because it affects us. As the planet warms, water evaporates faster out of the oceans and lakes and rivers. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor sitting up there for the storm to pick up and dump on us. So our heavy rain events are getting stronger. That's what it looks like in Toronto, where I live. That's what it looks like in Bangladesh. At the same time, and this is kind of crazy, our droughts are getting stronger because if a storm doesn't come along, the water's still evaporating faster, and so it leaves us with dried out soils, which looks like this in Texas, where I live, and it looks like that in Syria, where a record-breaking drought that was at least partially caused by climate change was responsible for driving people into the city in 2008 and 2009, leading to incredibly high unemployment rates, which didn't cause the refugee crisis, but it exacerbated it. It made it worse. What else is happening? Hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water, and more than 90% of the extra heat that blanket is trapping is going into the oceans. So hurricanes are getting stronger. And up in the Arctic, there aren't just polar bears, there's people. And there's over 200 Native American villages where the ground under their feet is literally thawing and crumbling and falling into the ocean because the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. We're seeing impacts all over the world. And why do we care about this? We care about it because this is who is impacted the most by a changing climate. The people who are poor, the people who are vulnerable, the people who already live off $1 or $2 a day. And when the price of food doubles due to crop failures or heat waves or droughts or floods, they go hungry. This is why we care about a changing climate. We care about it because we look at who is most impacted, and then we look at where all these heat-trapping gases have come from over the last 100 years, and it's pretty much exactly the opposite. And we know that that's not fair and that is not just. So if we look to the Bible, we know that it doesn't tell us anything about climate change. It was written 2,000 years ago. But it tells us a lot about our attitudes. It tells us, for example, that if we have worldly means and we see a brother in need and we refuse them compassion, how can the love of God remain in us? It doesn't mean that we're going to lose our salvation, but it means we have this new heart from God. That how can we express that love to people if we ignore their needs? Let us love not in word and speech, but in deed and truth. Let us walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. And, as they say in Texas, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it. This is the Texas translation of the Bible. It's available only on road signs. I grew up as a missionary kid in South America. I had friends who lived in neighborhoods like this if they were lucky, in homes made of bamboo and cardboard boxes from Tide detergent if they weren't so lucky. And I know firsthand how vulnerable people can be to natural disasters and to the type of natural disasters that are being exacerbated or worsened by a changing climate. Now, let's talk about two more what about questions. And these are more Christian but what about questions. People are starving today because they literally don't have enough food to eat. People are dying, millions of people every year, because they don't have access to clean water to drink. People are dying today of diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2016. So we may say, why worry about climate change now? Let's fix poverty and hunger, water shortages, injustice, sicknesses. Let's fix these first and we'll fix climate change after. Well, imagine if you break your leg, some of you probably have, and you go to the hospital and they x-ray your leg. While they're x-raying your leg, they don't just see the broken bone, they see that you also have a tumor on your leg. What's the first thing they're going to do? Hopefully set your leg, right? But are they just going to send you home and say, well, we'll worry about the tumor later, come back in 10 years, we have about 85 more broken bones to set, so we'll just deal with you, 10 years from now? No. They'll also set up a program to make sure that they address the tumor now before it becomes life-threatening. That's an analogy for climate change. If we pour all of our money and effort and hope and prayer into a bucket to try to fix hunger and poverty, injustice, illnesses and death, we're trying to fix all these issues, but climate change is poking holes in our bucket. And if we don't start fixing that issue, pretty soon we're not going to be able to fix the other issues either. That's why we care about a changing climate. So, here's the thing. We care about a changing climate because it affects real people, especially people who are poor and vulnerable. But if it's really caused by this extra blanket we're wrapping around the planet, blanket that comes from burning coal and gas and oil, how do we fix this thing? Because I don't know about you, but I came here in a car today. I was at a retreat for Christian leaders a few years ago, and one well-meaning Christian leader said something there. He said, every time you get in a car and turn it on, you're sinning. I thought to myself, are you serious? So I take my child to the doctor and I'm sinning? I go visit my grandmother, who's 94, and I'm sinning by doing that? I honestly felt, I have to confess to you, I felt like going out in the parking lot, finding a Hummer, and just doing donuts around him. That's what I felt like. And that is why who we are as Christians and that first gift that God gave us is so important. Because we are no longer people who have to act out of guilt or fear, compulsion, laws, regulations. We are people who have the love of God poured out into our hearts. Why? So that Christ can dwell in our hearts through faith. We are rooted and grounded in love so that we can do what our heart truly desires. We can trust our heart because our heart is new. Our mindsets are being renewed. Our software, our brains, our attitudes, they need some fixing. But our heart, our true desires have been changed by God as part of this gift so that we can give, not grudgingly, not under compulsion or regulation, but cheerfully. And often we see this verse used to talk about money, but isn't time an even bigger gift than money, or effort, prayer, even caring? We're told to throw ourselves wholeheartedly into God's way of doing things. Sin can no longer tell us how to live. We're not living under the tyranny of it anymore. We're living in freedom. But we shouldn't use that freedom as an opportunity to sit back, fold our hands, and wait for the ticket to heaven. We're told to live serving each other through love. The whole law is fulfilled in one statement: love your neighbor as yourself. So what does this look like when it comes to an issue of climate change? If you're like me, you're like, okay, that sounds great. But what do I do? If she's going to say a light bulb, I'm going to scream. Now, don't knock the light bulbs, because if every house in the US replaced one old incandescent light bulb with a new LED that you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot for $3, that would be like taking 1 million cars off the road. So don't knock the light bulbs. Also, you don't have to change them for a long time. I don't know about you, but I hate changing light bulbs. But if you could do one thing about what we're talking about today, you know what it would be? It would be to talk about it. Because you know what? We don't talk about it. Why? Because climate change has become one of the most politicized issues in the entire United States. It is more politicized than gun control, abortion, and immigration. Why? A thermometer isn't Democrat or Republican. God's creation doesn't tell you a different answer depending on how you vote. But the solutions are political, so we sheer away and we're afraid of talking about it. I got to visit Houghton College last year and have great discussions with the students there. And one of the students told me very candidly, I'm really concerned about this issue, but I can't talk about it with my friends because I'm afraid they'll reject me. One of the simplest, yet also sometimes one of the hardest things we can do is talk about it, but not argue over the science, not pull out our politics and beat each other over the head with it, but talk from the heart. Why do I, as a Christian, care? Why am I concerned? What does God's love say to me? Talk about it. And then if we want to act, check out climatecaretakers.org. It's an online Christian organization, an online community, for us to get ideas of what we can do to act together. Every month, they send you an email with a new idea. And you say, all right, I can do that. And if I want to do more, here's idea number 2 or idea number 3. What else might it look like? We're all part of a body. We're the body of Christ. You might be a hand. I might be a liver. You might be the brain. So what we do will look different. We all act from the heart, but whatever we do looks different. We might be like this church in Minnesota that decided to offer their roof as a solar community garden to their neighbors. We might be like the churches in England that are encouraging everybody to, yeah, I'm sorry, they are switching their light bulbs, but they're saving the money and they're giving the saved money to missions. We can invest in helping other people prepare, like these incredible fog nets in Africa that trap water vapor and turn it into rain. Or organizations that are putting solar panels on the roofs of some of the 1 billion people who live without energy today. We can support organizations like World Vision and Micah Challenge that understand how climate change is affecting poor and vulnerable people, and they are working with them from the heart, sharing God's love. Because the bottom line is that caring about God's creation, people and all of the other living things that God created, caring about God's creation is a true expression of our faith and our responsibility and of the love that God has given us in our hearts. As Paul says in the book of Galatians, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Thank you.
Okay. I want to thank everyone for your submitting your questions. And so a couple prefaces. Number one, there's universal agreement that everyone loves the way you say a boat. That's awesome. We love Canadians. All right. Second, I just want to preface this with welcome to Philly. They can come straight out and ask you a question. So the first one is, this was asked the last service, but I thought it was important to bring this up. There are lots of reports about the climate change community manipulating data. Lots of questions about, okay, the data that you're providing, is it trustworthy?
Yeah.
The climate change community manipulating data to fit their agenda. How can I trust science and data to fit? How can I trust the science and data where there are reports of manipulation? Who do you listen to? You know?
Man, it is tough because when we turn on one TV channel versus another, when we go to one website versus another, we hear people saying exactly the opposite things. Have you ever had that experience? How do we know who to trust? That's a tough question. Usually what we do is we go to people who share our values and sometimes even share our faith, right? If they believe the same way as I do about the sanctity of life, the economy, ideology, politics, then I'm going to trust what they say about climate change. Here's the problem with that today, though. The problem is that depending on who we listen to, the information we're getting is false. And when I say false, I mean wrong, a lie. I know that I'm personally accused of any type of malfeasance almost on a daily basis. Why? Because if you discredit the messenger, then what they're saying can't possibly be true. I have colleagues who were formally accused of manipulating the temperature data we looked at from all the different weather stations around the world to show that it was warming. Now, you know now that it doesn't matter. You could throw out all the thermometers because we have 26,500 natural thermometers in creation telling us it's warming. But a lot of people don't know that, and so they thought, oh, I heard that those scientists are manipulating that data to make it look like it's warming when it isn't. Well, did you know that that accusation was taken very seriously, and those scientists were subject to not one, not two, not five, but 9 formal investigations in the United States, Canada, UK, Europe, government, scientific organizations. 9, imagine if you had to stand trial 9 times for the same thing. And every time you were judged innocent, not guilty, every single time, and people still thought you were guilty. Why? Because people know that if you attack the messenger and you discredit the messenger, then it can't possibly be true. The reality is that God's creation is telling us this is real. And rather than shutting our eyes and plugging our ears and saying, it's not real, the reality is sometimes we have to look at an unpleasant truth and have to say, all right, what is God's love in my heart telling me is the right response? Not guilt and not fear, but love, power, and a sound mind to make good choices.
This is my question.
Sure.
This is the only question that's mine.
He gets the question.
I saw in a conference where you were speaking where you said you refuse to do TV interviews where it's basically a 2-person panel, where it's the person that basically is denying climate change and you're being asked to go and support the science behind climate change. You refuse to do those. Why is that?
Great question. So often when you turn on the TV, you'll see one head saying, this is real and serious, and we should all be really worried about it, and then there's somebody else saying, it's not real, it's just a hoax, you're making it up. It's good TV. It's fun to see people argue. But the social science has shown, social science is the study of us people, has shown that the number one piece of information that makes the biggest difference to us when it comes to this issue is the simple statement, scientists agree. Over 97% of scientists agree not just that climate is changing and not just that humans are responsible, but we are the primary cause of the warming today, and it's very serious. So when you see people, one person saying yes and one person saying no, what do we think it is? We think it's 50-50. And when they've surveyed people out in the public, most of us think it's 50-50. And if it's 50-50, well then why worry about it? We'll just wait until they make up their minds, right? The reality is that we have known that burning coal and gas and oil is wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, that the earth is running a fever, and that it's affecting us. You know how long we've known that for? Over 150 years. The science is really old, and that's why so many scientists agree. And that's why I don't want to participate in anything that suggests that we aren't in agreement, because that's not true. And I think a commitment to truth is one of the most important things that we have. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So related to that, a lot of questions about policy, particularly politicians. And someone asked, this country just elected a climate change denier into the highest office of the land who believes that China invented climate change to destroy our economy. How have you seen politicians try to shape and confuse the science and obfuscate the science behind climate change? And why, more importantly, do you think they're doing that?
Mm-hmm. So I get a chance to often speak with a lot of elected officials offline, behind closed doors. And when I do, the vast majority of them say, oh yeah, of course climate change is real. And yeah, it's probably very serious. And so I say, well, for goodness sakes, why are you standing up in public and saying it's a hoax? And they say, well, because I can't get reelected if I say it isn't. Now, not everybody. There are a few people who are genuinely sold out, but the majority of politicians we hear today are just afraid that they won't get reelected if they say it's real. So one of the most important things we can do is call our elected officials, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, and say, hey, I care about climate change and I support you if you come out and say this is real and we need to fix it. And so one of my favorite organizations is a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. You can find them here, and they have chapters in Philadelphia. They're not a faith-based organization, but they welcome us. They welcome Christians. I'm one of their science advisors. And I love them because they kindly and patiently and gently and very lovingly talk with every politician from every end of the spectrum about how there are libertarian solutions to climate change. There are free market solutions to climate change. There are solutions that are compatible with Republican ideals or conservative ideals. And I have seen them do amazing things to the point where they have a bipartisan climate solutions caucus in Congress now that has 12 Republicans and 12 Democrats as members. And as far as I know, those are the only 12 Republicans who are willing to stand up and say it's real, and it's because they have that caucus and that cover.
Okay, a lot of texts came this morning talking about how you, as a female scientist, one question was, you're a tremendous role model for the impact of women in higher education and in science in particular. Did you face, and this is a personal question, I think a lot of people wanted to know, did you face any challenges on your path towards becoming a scientist who was also female? And connected to that, very, very close to that is, how have you been received in the scientific community as a person of faith who is also a scientist?
Great questions. So I work in a field, physical science, where 90% of my colleagues are male. And growing up, though, majoring in physics as an undergrad, I actually had incredibly supportive professors. I had professors who would actually call me into their office and say, we don't have enough girls in this program, let me know what I can do to help you. But as you get older, as you move through your career, and this is not unique to universities or academia, I think many of us have this experience. Often there's a situation where people don't like the fact that you're not the same as them. And because of that, they'll try to put you down, and they'll call you things, and they'll try to block what you do. And so I've definitely faced my share of hurdles in life. But feeling like what I'm doing is actually my calling has made all the difference in the world. When I first started studying science, I did it because it fascinated me. And then I did it because I felt like I was trying to figure out what God was thinking when he made this world. And then I started doing it because I realized that I actually had some skills and abilities that I could use to help people. Up to that point, I thought, well, there's no way I can help people because I faint at the sight of blood. But I realized, hey, climate change is real and it's affecting people too, and I can help. And then I started to realize, you know what, maybe this is actually not just my vocation, maybe it's actually my calling. And so that, I feel like, is what has gotten me through those times. Now, back about 8 years ago was when my husband and I decided to write a book together. And it's a book about a Christian perspective on climate change. How do we know this is real? Why do we care? And what's a Christian response? We're putting out a second edition of that book pretty soon. It's going to be on Amazon. And if you want to find out about it, just follow my Facebook page or check out my website. But when I published that book, I was nervous because up until that point, none of my colleagues knew I was a Christian, except for maybe a couple of my good friends. Now, it wasn't, keeping it a secret. It's just that we just don't talk about anything other than science because we love it, because we're such nerds. We just don't. So I was nervous because I knew from the conversations I had heard around the water cooler, so to speak, that Christians weren't really on board with climate change, and a lot of scientists thought Christians were idiots. So when we published this book, I was really afraid that I was flushing my academic career down the toilet, the academic career that I had sweated blood for over the last 2 decades. And I have to say that the most humbling thing happened. After we published that book, after I told everybody I was a Christian, kind of stood back and waited for all the blackballing to begin, it never came. I have colleagues to this day coming up to me and saying, "We read your book at church." Or, "I don't share your faith, but I think what you're doing is great." I feel so blessed that in my field I have the most amazing colleagues in the world. And I could not do what I am doing without the support of many Christian scientists that you don't know but who exist and who are real. I should say scientists who are Christians. Yes, not Christian scientists. There are many more of us than you might imagine. And there are also many who are not Christians, but who care deeply about people and about this planet. Now, the flip side of that is actually the sad part, and that is what I didn't expect when I published our book. What I didn't expect was all the hate I got from fellow Christians. I would say for every email or letter or Facebook comment I get saying you're an idiot for believing in a myth like God, and I do get those, for every one of those I get 99 from somebody who's a Christian, saying nasty stuff that I don't really want to repeat, but nothing that expresses the love of God, let's just put it that way. And so that's why, circling back, what's one of the most important things we can do about this issue, about the issue of justice and love and caring for the poor, and how our choices and our actions are affecting people today? One of the biggest things we can do is talk about it, and talk not starting from the head, but starting from the heart. Because that is our secret weapon. We have a new heart, and we have God's love in that heart, and that's what we've been given to share with the world.
Last two quick,
Okay.
yep. Oh, hold on, you're going to, last 2 quick questions. More than 60% of the questions, in some way, shape, or form, are asking the question, can it be reversed? Mm-hmm. And second, what would be the most important thing to share with others, having been here today? Out of everything that you shared, what would be the most important thing to share?
Okay. So if you're looking for more information, if you go to the next slide here, if you're looking for more information, Skeptical Science is great for science questions. I have this little digital PBS series called Global Weirding. They're short, tiny little videos from 1 to 4 minutes long that you can share on social media to start conversations. I have my website and my Facebook page too, so check those out if you want more answers. But in short form, can we reverse this thing? I think eventually we can. But first of all, we have to say, yes, this is real. We have to wean ourselves off old, dirty ways of getting energy. And then there is some amazing technology coming along, like technology to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into baking soda. That stuff is there, but we need it, and we need it fast, and we also need to stop burning all of this carbon too. So what's the one thing that we can do? The one thing we can do, I think, is talk about why we care about it, and about how there are solutions. Because the main reason why just about everybody objects to the science actually has nothing to do with the science. If we are honest with ourselves, or if we have an honest conversation with Uncle Joe, who says, oh, it's not real, it's just a hoax, that conversation within 1 minute will get to the fact that we, or Uncle Joe, has a big problem with the government telling us what to do, or with legislation. So talking about solutions, positive inspirational solutions, is one of the biggest things we can do, and that's why on my Facebook page, I would say almost every other post I do is talking about cool solutions like those solar panel shingles. So, thank you.
Well, yesterday we were texting back and forth. We lost count of how many flights got canceled coming into Philly from Toronto. You spent the better part of the entire day. You got to bed at 1 a.m. You were up early. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in our community here, and we want to let you know that we were going to steward very well what we've learned and be advocates for change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.